Have you ever imagined that one day, Canadians, those gentle neighbors who once deeply admired America, would quietly turn their backs on the symbols of the American dream? No protests, no slogans, just simply stop buying a cup of coffee, no longer choose the familiar pair of shoes, and turn away from names that were once a source of pride. In 2025, Canada didn't get angry. They chose again. With their wallets, with their meals, and even with the dream of a university degree. When trust is no longer imported. Canada and the quiet boycott that changed everything. No one expected that the first economic blow in the 2025 U.S.-Canada tension would come not from legal documents, not from controversial statements, but from a wallet, and more importantly, from where people decided not to take money out. In April 2025, the U.S. suddenly imposed high import tariffs on Canadian goods under Section 301, an act once used to handle disputes with China, but never aimed at a close ally like Canada. That move, though described by the White House as a technical and necessary adjustment, was perceived very differently by Canadians, as a slap in the face. And yet, no one slammed the table. No one took to the streets with banners. Canada, a country not fond of noise, responded in its own way, by choosing. A choice that needed no vote, no slogan, but carried the weight of a national election. People began walking away from stores stamped with American identity. Brands once thought of as irreplaceable, Starbucks, McDonald's, CocaCola, suddenly became the first to be questioned. But behind it all, this is not a story about goods. This is a story about trust. And when trust is taken for granted, it doesn't crack in pieces, it collapses all at once. Since World War II, economic relations between the U.S. and Canada have been built not only on agreements and numbers, but on something more fragile. Cultural closeness, alignment of values, and a rare intimacy between two nations. Canadians used to casually carry U.S. dollars in their wallets, watch American shows on TV, dream of attending U.S. universities, and buy American products not out of obligation, but out of familiarity. But what happens when the country you once trusted like family turns around and imposes harsh conditions on you? Canadians understood clearly. A tariff policy doesn't just affect prices, it is a cold declaration of priorities. And they responded not with rage, but with distance. The beauty, and also the pain of this shift, lies in the fact that no one was forced to do anything. No document required a boycott. No one led a protest. It was just a quiet decision made in front of two store shelves, a morning coffee, a familiar click. But each small action became a brick in the reconstruction of consumption. From Toronto to Calgary, from small towns in Nova Scotia to shopping centers in Vancouver, an unnamed movement spread. Choose again. Where you shop was no longer just a matter of convenience. It became a test of community consciousness, of wounded trust, and of priority in an era of political and economic upheaval. And when those choices are repeated every day, they don't just change business figures. They reshape the market structure. They shake the foundation of once untouchable American brand icons in Canada. What scares American corporations most is not a call for boycott, but silence. Organized silence, because no one told anyone to act, yet everyone acted the same. For years, U.S. politics assumed it could treat close partners like rivals, writing laws, imposing tariffs, cutting incentives, without fear of losing trust. But they forgot that when trust is the only glue in a relationship, no economic policy, no matter how sophisticated, can buy back a broken sentiment. The year 2025 won't be remembered as a year of trade crisis, but as the year Canadians stopped seeing the consumption of American goods as natural. And once the obvious is questioned, everything can change, from meals to coffee to the university dreams that once defined an entire generation's pride. Starbucks and the lesson from an abandoned cup of coffee. People often say that big changes begin with the smallest things. And on an ordinary morning in Canada, that smallest thing might have been a cup of coffee no longer called by name. Starbucks, a brand once symbolic of morning routines and a globalized lifestyle, suddenly became the first victim in a wave of change called consumer pride. No cups were burned, no stores smashed, but customers vanished as quickly as steam rising off a hot coffee on a cold Toronto morning. Their absence was the loudest voice of all. This wasn't Starbucks' first time facing hardship. Over the years, the brand had learned to survive social crises, from criticism over labor rights to campaigns demanding transparency in coffee sourcing. But never before had it encountered such a calm withdrawal as in Canada in 2025. There was no outrage, only weariness, and a quiet question echoing, "Why am I still drinking here?" When the United States tightened trade policy with Canada, few expected the ripple effects to reach every street corner cafe. But in truth, the people understood better than anyone else. A heavy-handed policy doesn't just affect soybean prices or steel imports. It affects how you feel holding a cup of coffee in your hand, realizing that your money may be feeding something that no longer feels like your own. At a small shop in Victoria, the owner, once a loyal Starbucks fan, shared that new customer traffic surged so fast she had to hire 2 extra baristas within 2 weeks. One regular, who used to appear every morning with a Starbucks cup in hand, now sat quietly with a handcrafted cappuccino, looking out at the street. When asked why, he simply replied, "Because I want to know what I'm drinking, and who's benefiting from that cup." The choice wasn't about rejecting coffee, but about returning to awareness. Starbucks wasn't boycotted because of bad coffee. It was questioned because it represented a system where profits flowed back to Seattle, while local coffee shops, the soul of the neighborhood, struggled to survive. And in that clear-eyed turning away, people began to realize something deeper. Sometimes, consumption isn't about buying what you like, but buying what you believe in. A Canadian could easily spend $6 every morning. That's not the issue. But they began to ask, who is that money supporting? A multinational corporation? Or the barista down the block, barely making rent? It wasn't just a city story. In rural areas, where Starbucks had little presence, the shift was even more pronounced. An app called Maple Roast, designed to highlight local cafes, quickly climbed to the top of Canada's App Store, surpassing even banking and sports apps in May. People began writing reviews, sharing addresses, recommending non-American cafes with a newfound pride. But not everyone was happy about it. A 28-year-old barista in Quebec, who had worked at Starbucks for 6 years, burst into tears when she learned her store was closing. She had done nothing wrong, but in this game of power and trust, people like her were the first casualties. "We're Canadians," she said. "We just wear the Starbucks uniform. We don't represent any policies." That irony exposes the paradox of globalization. Global brands live off individuals, and when consumers turn away out of a sense of betrayal, the ones who suffer first are the low-level employees with no say in anything. Starbucks responded quickly, launching a Northern Brew campaign with flavors tailored for Canada, even adding the maple leaf to the packaging. But for many, it was too little, too late. Because once a feeling of hurt, even slight, has taken root, no marketing campaign can erase it. A cup of coffee that once felt meaningless suddenly became a litmus test for a value system. It made people question not just the flavor, but trust, community, and whether they still belong to a consumer culture that was becoming increasingly impersonal. And perhaps the most important point is this: Canadians didn't reject Starbucks because they disliked it. but because they chose themselves again. Calmly but decisively. McDonald's and a child's question. Mom, why don't we eat something from our own country? If a morning cup of coffee can change a habit, then a family meal can shake an entire memory. And when the Happy Meal box, once a small weekend joy, suddenly became something to avoid, people realized this was no longer simply an economic story. It had touched something deeper. Collective memory. McDonald's was never just fast food. In Canada, it was tied to first birthdays, after-school treats, weekend outings, rewarded with a hot burger and a little toy. It was part of urban memory. But in 2025, a small shift in a child's question knocked everything off its axis. Mom, why don't we eat something from our own country? A simple question, but like a needle piercing through the shell of routine. The mother, a white-collar worker in Mississauga, sat stunned in her car, looking through the window at the McDonald's they used to visit every weekend. Inside, the lights were still golden, the menu unchanged, but this time she didn't go in. She turned the car around and for the first time stopped by a small shop near home, where the beef came from a local farm, where the cook knew her child's name, and where a burger didn't carry the unease of what her dollars were truly funding. Those small, quiet decisions created an underground wave. In just the third quarter of 2025, McDonald's revenue in major cities like Toronto, Vancouver, and Calgary dropped 16%. A number that might seem modest for a global giant, but clearly signaled one thing. Consumers were no longer choosing them the way they used to. This shift didn't come from taste. McDonald's kept its original recipes, still pleased children with its sweet ketchup and crispy fries. But adults had changed. And in an era where consumption is a quiet political act, adults began to look at each burger as a question. What am I really supporting? In Ottawa, a local burger joint that had struggled throughout the pandemic now had to hire more staff, extending hours on weekends. In Halifax, the owner of Fisher's Fry said customer traffic rose by 40% in just 2 months. What's worth noting, many customers didn't come for novelty. They came because they no longer wanted to take their kids to McDonald's. In that climate, McDonald's couldn't stay silent. New ad campaigns launched, highlighting that their stores in Canada are locally operated, employ Canadian workers, and pay local taxes. But perhaps they came too late, because what Canadian consumers had lost was not faith in the food's quality, but in the system behind the food. A 62-year-old employee in British Columbia, who had worked at McDonald's for over 20 years, shared through tears. We're not the ones making the policies. We're the ones wearing the aprons, cleaning the tables, and trying to smile every shift. But in that context, individual goodwill isn't enough to erase the feeling of collective betrayal. In reality, many McDonald's outlets in Canada are franchises. They don't belong to the U.S. headquarters, nor do they have a say in foreign policy between the two countries. But when the golden M becomes associated with trade pressure, even the most innocent outlets can't escape skeptical glances. Not everyone agrees with the boycott wave. Some argue that turning away from American brands is no different than hurting one's own community, since the first to lose their jobs are often Canadians themselves. But choices, like all social actions, have never been absolute. They always swing between ethics and practicality, between pride and fear of loss. And then, everything circles back to that original question. Why don't we eat something from our own country? A naive question, but echoing the voice of a nation trying to redefine the meaning of closeness. Not every American brand is wrong. But when the core values of collaboration are damaged, even the most familiar things can become distant. McDonald's didn't lose customers because it wasn't tasty enough. They lost because people started eating with a question in mind. And when a meal is no longer just about filling the stomach, but about preserving identity, the choice becomes more complex than any menu. And that's when a burger is no longer just food. It becomes a statement, quiet, but impossible to ignore. Amazon and the fatigue of a click. One day, people realized they no longer felt comfortable hitting the place order button. Not because the item was more expensive, not because shipping was slower, but because of a feeling that was hard to name. As if every purchase was helping sustain a system they had begun to question. And in that seemingly meaningless moment, Amazon, the symbol of convenience, found itself on the list of names to be reconsidered. Until now, Amazon wasn't just an e-commerce platform. It was the new definition of modern consumption. Fast, efficient, no need to leave the house. With a single click, everything, from toothbrushes to refrigerators, could appear at your doorstep within 24 hours. For many Canadians, Amazon had been a trusted companion during the pandemic, when the world shut down. But in 2025, that convenience was no longer enough to justify the growing internal conflict. It all began when the U.S. government expanded its tariff policy under Section 301, causing the price of imported goods from Canada to spike significantly. Canadians didn't immediately blame Amazon. After all, Amazon didn't write the laws, but within a few weeks, they began looking at their orders with different eyes. Why am I still buying a book printed in the U.S., shipped across the border, when there's a small bookstore down the street struggling for customers? Why am I still paying for a Prime account to get perks on imported goods when the domestic economy is quietly collapsing? According to the Canadian E-commerce Association, in just the first 2 months of 2025, Amazon Prime cancellations rose by 24%. No noise, no campaign, just one person at a time, quietly unsubscribing, closing tabs, and stepping out of the familiar cycle. At the same time, traffic surged on domestic platforms like Well.ca, BookCity, and Etsy Canada. An app called Local Loop, which connects consumers to stores within a 2-kilometer radius, reached over 1 million downloads in less than 6 weeks. A retired couple in Toronto, once loyal Amazon customers for nearly a decade, decided not to buy the Kindle they had planned on. Instead, they returned to physical books, buying from a corner shop where the owner remembered their favorite genres. The wife said, "We don't hate Amazon, but if we've lived here for over 30 years, then why not support our neighbor first?" The story didn't stop at books. From household goods and supplements to electronics, Canadians began shifting, not out of hatred, but out of exhaustion. With dependency, with an invisible consumption model, and with the feeling that every mouse click was an accidental cut into the community they lived in. A generation once proud of being able to buy everything online now asked, "What have I lost in making things so easy?" For many, hitting delete account wasn't rebellion. It was a return to the paths they once knew, where the shopkeeper knew their name, where every item was chosen by hand, not algorithm. They no longer shopped because of urgency, but because they wanted to preserve the human connections fading in the digital age. But like Starbucks and McDonald's, Amazon wasn't the first to suffer. A warehouse manager in British Columbia, once employing over 200 workers, shared in despair. "When orders dropped, we cut hours. No one blames the customers, but for us, it's our livelihood." He's Canadian. So are his employees. But when consumers begin to question transparency and ethical consumption, the consequences fall on those closest to them. In this quiet migration, silence became the strongest weapon. No more long lines of Amazon delivery vans on the street. No more signature shipping boxes at the door. Small changes, but together they marked an economic turning point. A global platform worth hundreds of billions of dollars was quietly rejected, not through opposition, but through withdrawal. The question here isn't, Is Amazon wrong? But are we trading too much of what matters for convenience? And while some are still finding faster ways to order, others are stepping out the door, returning to familiar stores, and feeling like they're finally in the right place. Because sometimes the choice isn't about price or delivery speed, it's about whether we still trust what we just did or not. Coca-Cola, and when a sip of soda becomes a matter of honor. No one expected that the first thing to be rejected at the dinner table would be a can of soda. Not because it was too sweet or out of fear of obesity, but because of something deeper, quieter, a sense of dignity. In Canada in 2025, people no longer called Coca-Cola by name as they used to. There were no public boycott campaigns, no leaders, but at family meals, in fast food restaurants, at movie theaters, or stadiums, people began asking for something else. Canada Dry, please. Do you have something local? I'll take a 1642 cola instead of Coke. And just like that, one of the most enduring symbols of American culture began to slip from its once unshakable place. It all stemmed from the U.S.-Canada trade disruption, when the United States increased tariffs on imports in 2025. But what caused Coca-Cola to crumble in Canada wasn't simply operational costs or rising prices, it was the feeling that consumers no longer belonged to that brand. Each Coke can was no longer just a refreshment. It had become a symbol of contradiction between beautiful memories and the cold reality of broken trust. A family restaurant owner in Nova Scotia, who had sold Coca-Cola for over 3 decades, recalled the moment she realized she needed to change. No one said anything, but gradually, customers began skipping the combos with Coke. I watched them walk straight out the door without ordering. I knew they were sending a message, and so she took down the old ad sign, placed a crate of Canada Dry next to the cash register. No explanation was given, but none was needed. Coca-Cola's revenue in Canada dropped 27% in the second quarter of 2025. Not a small number, but what was lost was greater: a sense of familiarity. The invisible bond between a soda can and a summer picnic, between the red branding and collective memories, passed from generation to generation. When people rejected Coca-Cola, they weren't rejecting the product, they were redrawing the boundaries of trust. Coca-Cola, a brand long revered for its emotional connection strategies, responded immediately. They launched the Northern Lights Edition, a special can featuring the maple leaf, maple syrup flavor, and the promise of being made just for Canada. But everything had changed. Grand gestures no longer held weight when the hurt had already quietly spread. Movie chains in Toronto posted signs reading Coke-free zone. A university in Vancouver replaced all its vending machines with local brands. Several upscale restaurants in Montreal even stated on their menus, "We do not serve Coca-Cola." Not out of hatred, but out of pride. Between the feeling of being served and the feeling of being respected, Canadian consumers chose the latter. For many, giving up Coca-Cola wasn't a breakup, but a release. A symbolic choice. I still like soda, but I want to know what I'm supporting. And when those choices are repeated on a large scale, even a soda can become a mirror reflecting community values. However, no one wins entirely in this parting. A small distributor in Manitoba, who had worked with Coca-Cola for over 20 years, shared with a worried look, "We're not political. But now inventory is piling up. Orders are being canceled one after another, and I don't know if I can keep my staff next month." He didn't speak angrily, just sadly, because he knew that what he had devoted his life to was no longer seen the same. Coca-Cola once blended flavor and symbolism, but in 2025 in Canada, that symbol is no longer whole, no longer a cultural connection, but a sense of being imposed upon. People no longer drank it out of enjoyment, but out of habit. And when habit is replaced by an ideal, no matter how small, Even a sip of soda can become a declaration of honor. In an era where every act of consumption carries more meaning, a soda can is no longer just a beverage. It's a question. Are you drinking out of habit or out of belief? And for Canadians in 2025, the answer was clear. They chose again, not for taste, but for self-respect. Maybe Coca-Cola will come back. Maybe a new marketing campaign will win hearts again. But for now, in every family kitchen, every small eatery, every friendly gathering, where there once was a cold Coke, now comes a quiet request. I'll have something Canadian, please. And that simple sentence, gentle as it may sound, is a statement that needs no speech. Harley-Davidson and when freedom is no longer a roar. If Coca-Cola is a symbol of American mass consumer culture, then Harley-Davidson is the embodiment of something higher: freedom. For Canadians, the Harley wasn't just a vehicle, it was a statement of life. The open road, the wind, the roar of the engine, and a sense of untethered living. A Harley parked in front of the house was once a symbol of the American dream. No visa required. But then 2025 came, and that symbol began slipping away from the hearts of those who once loved it most. It happened gradually. No bikes were set on fire in protest. No groups publicly declared a Harley boycott. But dealerships in Alberta and Saskatchewan began to go quiet. Biker meetups became sparse. Motorcycle forums, once buzzing with noise, shifted toward discussions about local electric bikes or European brands. The strange part was, Canadians didn't weaken Harley with outrage. They did it with quiet but firm rejection. According to data from the Canadian Motorcycle Association, in just 3 months of mid-2025, Harley-Davidson's sales in Canada dropped by more than 35%, a number big enough to shake any brand. But what hurt Harley more wasn't the money. It was the silence from those who once saw the bike as part of their identity. In a small town near Manitoba, an old Harley, a 2007 model matte black, was listed on a local motorcycle forum. Its owner, a 63-year-old man who had once ridden across Canada post-retirement, had chronicled his journeys in a blog called Freedom by Engine. But this time, no new posts. Just a short note. Don't want to keep it anymore. Contact me if you really need it. He wasn't angry. He wasn't disappointed. He just no longer felt the bike represented him. When the U.S. government imposed tariffs on Canadian goods, Harley wasn't the first thing he thought of. But as his friends switched to Triumphs, Ducatis, even local electric bikes, he began to feel out of place. If what we call freedom is tied to injustice, is it still freedom? He wrote in an email to his old biker club. No one replied, but no one objected either. In Vancouver, a group of young bikers organized a silent ride, not on Harleys, but on Canadian-made electric motorcycles. No roaring engines, just quiet wheels rolling down the street with a small slogan taped to the side. We don't need noise to know we're headed in the right direction. It wasn't rebellion, it was replacement. Replacing a feeling that had grown old, a symbol they once took pride in, but now made them uneasy. This decline brought with it a wide ripple effect. Harley repair shops in rural Canada, once thriving thanks to a steady flow of imports, now reported continuous losses. Some owners had to switch to making farming equipment. Others shut down entirely. Not because Harley wasn't good, but because people no longer wanted to associate with a brand that represented a country they felt had stopped valuing a once close relationship. Harley-Davidson was once how Canadians felt they belonged to the American dream, without needing citizenship. Just an engine, a road, and the wind. But when that dream faded under heavy-handed and unfair behavior from the U.S., the bike, something thought to be above politics, became the first victim of broken trust. The question was no longer, is this bike powerful, but what does this bike stand for? Canadians didn't give up Harley because of the mechanics. They gave it up because it no longer made them feel like themselves. When a bike becomes a symbol of a political system, instead of an expression of personal freedom, letting go is no longer rebellion. It's maturity. A roaring machine, once the loudest voice of personal liberty, now sits quiet in a cold garage. Because sometimes, silence is the loudest way to say goodbye. Nike and when just do it becomes a question of identity. There was a time when wearing a pair of Nikes wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a statement. Just do it wasn't merely a slogan, it was a rallying cry for a generation living instinctively, daring to break boundaries, and unafraid to be different. In cities like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, Air Maxes, Jordans, and Flyknits once graced classrooms, basketball courts, coffee shops, and even Monday morning meetings. But in 2025, people began to ask themselves, do I still see myself in these shoes? The wave of brand reevaluation didn't stop at food, soda cans, or motorcycles. It quietly seeped into even the lightest of items. A pair of sneakers, a familiar logo on fabric, a choice that once required no thought. But now, things are different. Following a series of U.S. tariff policies, many Canadians started viewing Nike with a wary eye. Not because of declining quality or less appealing designs, but due to a growing disconnect between what the brand represented and what Canadian consumers began to feel was right. A 34-year-old graphic designer in Vancouver, who once owned over 20 pairs of Nikes, each marking a career milestone, found himself struck by a statement at a sustainable consumption seminar in April. We can't talk about personal freedom when the shoes on our feet come from an opaque production system and an unsympathetic supply chain. That remark didn't just appeal to logic, it touched emotions. Weeks later, he sold his entire collection and, for the first time, purchased a pair of recycled plastic shoes from a Quebec startup. They weren't flashy or cool, but upon wearing them, he remarked, "I feel lighter, not just on my feet." According to Retail Insight Canada, Nike's sales in Ontario, British Columbia, and Quebec dropped between 18% and 22% in Q2 2025. Notably, this decline wasn't among older demographics or those indifferent to brands, but among the youth, the very group that once elevated Nike to an irreplaceable icon. Yet, in 2025, they were the first to turn to local alternatives. Brands like Vessi, renowned for waterproof footwear, and companies recycling ocean plastic into rubber, saw their growth double or even triple within months. A significant driver of this shift was technology. An app named TreadRight, specializing in evaluating the ethics and transparency of brand supply chains, surpassed 800,000 downloads within 6 weeks of its launch. Here, brands were rated not just on quality, but also on environmental impact, human rights, local engagement, and social responsibility. While Nike still led in design, it no longer topped the charts in community belonging. This change in consumer mindset wasn't about rejecting emotions. Quite the opposite. It stemmed from consumers wanting to make purchases with both heart and mind. When a pair of shoes no longer makes you feel aligned with what's right, no matter how stylish, they become burdensome. Many in Canada's sneakerhead community felt a sense of loss. The meetups, custom competitions, and the thrill of acquiring limited editions all were integral parts of their youth. But, like friendships, sometimes we must part from cherished things not out of disdain, but because we've evolved, and those things no longer reflect who we are. At a small sneaker store in Halifax, the owner observed, "Young customers no longer ask about the latest releases. They inquire, where are these made? Do they support the local community? What materials are used? I never encountered such questions 5 years ago." Nike may continue to thrive globally, but in Canada, In 2025, what was once a global symbol now faces the introspection of discerning individuals. And in that reflection, the iconic swoosh sometimes mirrors a sense of detachment rather than the motivational "just do it" of yesteryears. Because when consumption becomes an act of belief, no brand, regardless of its might, is immune. And when a pair of shoes becomes a question of identity, it's your steps, not the logo beneath, that define who you are.